the Mises Circle at Furman. Thank you all for coming. I'm Tom DiLorenzo. I'm on Doug French. Doug French is in South Africa right now. So I'm told. I don't know why he's there or how he got there. I don't think he wasn't kidnapped, but I was asked to take his place in being the MC for the day, for the morning anyway. So that's what I'm doing. And special thanks, of course, to Stephen Sebastian, the student here at Furman, who is the organizer of the event. And he's involved with conservative students for a better tomorrow, and thanks to them also. He's corresponding to the Mises Circle. And a few announcements. The sponsors have requested that at the end of each talk, if there's Q&A, that we limit the Q&A to the students from Furman. But the speakers would be glad to talk to anybody during the breaks or at the end of the event, something like that. But we'd like to restrict Q&A to students during the actual assigned speaking time. Okay. And the three of us, Tom Woods and Bob Higgs and myself, will be happy to autograph any of our books, which we'll have for sale out there at 10:30. So beginning at 10:30, there'll be books out there during the breaks. You just fill out a card for a request and decide whatever you want to do as far as that goes. And the Mises Institute appreciates the generosity of all of its members who have contributed to make this possible, in addition to our sponsors for today. And we have students from 16 colleges and universities who have signed up to attend today. And so why don't the students stand up so you can see who the students are. Students are too embarrassed to ask a question to anybody as far as that goes. And special thanks also to Dean Williams, our sponsor for today. And Dean would like to say a few words himself here before I get started with the program. Can you just come up here?
Hi, my name is Dean Williams. I'm a Furman graduate, a former trustee, and a former chair of Furman's Advisory Council. When I was a student here, there was always a section roped off at homecoming in the McAllister Auditorium labeled Creek. And this was reserved for a few returning antiques who had graduated 50 years or more ago from Furman. We thought it was all very funny when we were students. With the passage of time, however, it seems a little less funny. So students, I bring you word from your future. There may be some truth in that old saying, we mock that which we shall become. I have a number of personal interests in your program today. One of them is that I provided some financial support to CSBT to help them bring these three prominent scholars to talk about governments and war. Another is that I've been a personal witness and participant in much of the history between official Furman and CSBT. CSBT, as you may know, has the distinction of being the only Furman student organization whose members have been publicly labeled as intellectually challenged by a tenured member of the faculty. At that moment, I felt great kinship with CSBT, and I became their friend. Another is the man whose name the Mises Institute honors, Ludwig von Mises. Despite his many accomplishments and mounting proof of his ideas, Dr. Mises also was dismissively labeled as intellectually challenged by the prevailing academics of his time. Our universities have led the way in demanding diversity of every type, but many are slow to welcome the only kind of diversity that some believe should really matter among scholars, and that is diversity of thought. That Dr. Mises' ideas have gained growing respect long after his death, while his critics are forgotten. is some consolation that in the long run, history does indeed judge us all fairly. My final personal connection with your program, Governments in War. My father was a career Marine. His father chased Pancho Villa on both sides of the Mexican border. Never caught him, by the way. I left Furman as a reserve lieutenant in the Army. And coming from that family, I was eager to do my part. I got my chance when they sent me to Vietnam. The year I was there, 12,000 young Americans were killed and 30,000 wounded. Not to mention what happened to the people and the infrastructure of that country. I have learned that in war there are no unwounded soldiers and that the costs to all are very high. And I ask a question now that I never asked before. Is it worth it? If you're new to Mises and you have brought an open mind, even one that's intellectually challenged, I envy you because I believe you're in for a good program. And now please welcome back Senior Fellow at the Mises Institute, Dr. Tom DiLorenzo, who will begin your program. Thanks.
Thanks, Dean. I didn't know you don't look like a 50-year alumnus. Furman. It's all well, there. It doesn't work. This is okay. All right. This is for short people, I guess. Stephen must have been up here. Okay, I'll see if that works. Multiple microphones here. Can you hear me all right? Okay, it's okay. Okay, the topic I gave, it was the genesis of the American warfare state, which is kind of a big topic, and there's a lot you can say about that. But since I've written a good bit about the American Civil War era and some of the decades after that, I thought that would be an appropriate for a first talk in this event. And if you've never read this essay, there's an essay, it's online. It's called War is the Health of the State by Randolph Bourne, B-O-U-R-N-E. And especially the students, if you're interested in this whole topic, you really must read this essay. It was published in the early 20th century, War is the Health of the State. And it's one of the most insightful articles about the topic of war I've ever read. And it's a real classic. So I'm going to start out by encouraging you to read that essay, I think, to get interested in this whole topic. And war certainly is the health of the state. I'll give you some examples. I'm going to start with the American Civil War, which I consider to be, really the first, the creation of the American military-industrial congressional complex, as we call it today. More than 100 years before President Eisenhower coined that phrase, military-industrial complex. There were wars prior to that, of course, and, but before the Civil War, the U.S. Army was relatively small. It was located in outposts, keeping an eye on Indians and things like that. Many of the West Point graduates who became generals in the Civil War had retired from the Army. General Sherman was a banker in Mississippi, for example, before he became General Sherman. And so the military wasn't much. Hold your applause, please. And the average American citizen, by the way, paid federal taxes of about $45 a year. And the only contact he ever had with the federal government before the Civil War was through the post office. And that's about it. And so it was a very different world back then, but it changed dramatically in a number of ways. We had the first income tax during the war, the first federal military conscription law. There were pervasive excise taxes imposed on just about everything to finance the war. The Internal Revenue Bureaucracy was created by the Lincoln administration during the war. There were 10 tariff increases. At the time, federal revenue was mostly tariff revenue on imports. About 90% or so of all federal tax revenue was on tariffs on imports at the time. And the Lincoln administration, Lincoln himself signed 10 tariff tax increases, so that by the end of the Civil War, the average tax on imports was close to 50%. And it remained in the 40 to 50% range until 1913, when we got the income tax. So that was a long-lasting tax increase there. The writ of habeas corpus was suspended for pretty much the duration of the Civil War. There were mass arrests of northern civilians by the tens of thousands. They were imprisoned in gulags such as Fort Lafayette in New York Harbor. There was a man named Dean Sprague who wrote a book called Freedom Under Lincoln, published by a university press, who remarked that the only place in the northern states during the Civil War where there was genuine free speech was in these prisons. Because if you're already in prison for speaking freely in opposition to the government, what have you got to lose? What are they going to do, put you in prison? And when I cited this in one of my books, I had emails from several people from Eastern Europe who said, well, this sounds just like it was under communism, where the only place you could speak freely was if you were in prison, if you were in the gulag for speaking freely against the communists. And so there are parallels there. Hundreds of newspapers were shut down in the northern, so I'm not talking about the South, I'm talking about the northern states. Well, I'm talking about the U.S. Army here in my talk. At the same time, Lincoln also issued an arrest warrant for the Chief Justice of the United States, Roger B. Taney, after Taney issued an opinion that his suspension of habeas corpus was unconstitutional. Rather than challenging it in court, he issued an arrest warrant. And the source of this was originally a lawyer and friend of Lincoln named Ward Layman, who wrote about it in his biography. But then there are other sources too. The mayor of Baltimore at the time was a personal friend of Judge Taney. He wrote about it in his memoirs. There's an official history of the U.S. Marshal Service that mentions the arrest warrant for Judge Taney. And the Justice of the Supreme Court, who resigned after the Dred Scott decision, wrote his memoirs, and he said that he knew, that Taney knew that there was an arrest warrant issued by the Lincoln administration for him. And so there was an attack on the separation of powers, in other words, with the intimidation of federal judges. And Taney was not the only federal judge who was intimidated in this way. In my book, Lincoln Unmasked, I dug up out of the archives a letter from a federal judge who wrote his fellow judges a letter explaining why he could not come to court that day to issue a writ of habeas corpus to a young man who had been accused by the government of criticizing the Lincoln administration. He said when he got home, his home was surrounded by federal soldiers who literally held him at gunpoint hostage in his own home so that he couldn't go to court the next day and issue the writ. And so that sort of thing went on during the Civil War. And of course, the military-industrial complex was created. When I was in Springfield, Illinois a couple of years ago, I gave a talk to the Illinois Libertarian Party convention, and I visited Springfield, visited Lincoln's home, and the part of town where he lived is called Old Aristocracy Road. It was all the biggest houses of all the wealthiest politically connected people in Illinois of the day. And so, one of the things that sticks out of my mind is that Abe Lincoln lived in the biggest house on Old Aristocracy Road. And his next door neighbor, there's a plaque next to the house of his next door neighbor, was a tin cup manufacturer. And he sold tin cups. He miraculously, by sheer luck probably, I suppose, got the contract with the U.S. government to supply tin cups to the U.S. Army. So that was the sort of the start of the corrupt military-industrial complex system that Bob Higgs, our next speaker, has written about so much in many of his books and articles. And so war certainly is the health of the state. And these are just a few examples of what is meant by that. And it is always true that the healthier the state, the more unhealthy is the civil society and the private enterprise system and the degree of freedom in the country. We've long ago passed the idea where we have the night watchman state, where the state basically protects rights to life, liberty, and property. You know, the budget for the U.S. government to cover that was adequate under George Washington. But ever since then, it's all been one big transfer society for the most part, as opposed to a property rights protection society. And what I'd like to get into now is talking about the way in which the waging of war was established in America's first really big war, the American Civil War, and the U.S. government's war. So I'm not going to talk about the Confederate side of the war. My subject here is the U.S. Army. And there's a book called The Hard Hand of War by Mark Grimsley. Mark Grimsley is a defense historian. He's a consultant to the Defense Department and the Army. And he wrote this book, The Hard Hand of War. And I remember going to the beach and reading this at the beach on vacation once, where everyone else is reading Us magazine and things like that. The Hard Hand of War. Here's one of the things he said. He said the Army of the Potomac, which was the U.S. Army, possessed its full quotient of thieves, freelance foragers, and officers willing to look the other way. And it's a testament to Mark Grimsley that he can write this and still be a paid consultant to the Defense Department, I suppose. And so, in other words, even the defenders and promoters of the U.S. military establishment have to admit that certain truths. And another truth he admits to is that war was waged on the civilian population of the South from the very beginning in this war. For example, to retaliate against Confederate Army attacks, from the very beginning, one part of the routine was holding randomly chosen civilians as hostages, sometimes shooting them, and sometimes burning their houses to the ground. For example, there was a colonel named John Beatty who warned the residents of Paint Rock, Alabama, these are his words: "Every time the telegraph wire is cut, we will burn a house. Every time a train is fired upon, we will hang a man. And we will continue to do this until every house is burned and every man hanged between Decatur and Bridgeport, Alabama." And he ended up burning the entire town of Paint Rock to the ground while seizing 3 hostages. And there was also rampant vandalism by the U.S. Army during the war. And this is probably not news to a lot of South Carolinians. But if you ever saw the sequence of movies starting with Gettysburg, and then I think it was The Killer Angels, I think was the first book that was made into a movie, and then the sequel to that. When I saw it, I was shocked to notice that there was actually a scene of the looting of Fredericksburg, Virginia, because that's really politically incorrect to actually show U.S. Army soldiers looting private homes in their own country. But here's a first-hand account by a federal soldier of what happened. He said this: "Boys came in loaded with silver pitchers, silver spoons, silver lamps, and casters, etc. Great 3-story houses furnished magnificently were broken into and their contents scattered over the floors and trampled on by the muddy feet of the soldiers. Splendid alabaster vases and pieces of statuary were thrown at $600 and $700 mirrors. Closets of the very finest china were broken into and their contents smashed onto the floor in stamped pieces. Finest cut glass where goblets were hurled at 9 nice place-clad windows, beautifully embroidered window curtains torn down, rosewood pianos piled in the street and burned, where soldiers would get on top of them and kick the keyboard and internal machinery all to pieces." And so this was just a riot upon the civilian population. And of course, the same sort of thing went on for 4 years, especially with Sherman's march through South Carolina. And one of the neoconservative war apologists, who's one of my favorites, Victor Davis Hanson, wrote about this once when he knows about all these stories of Sherman's bummers, as they were called, and the destruction of personal property and the murder of civilians. And he claims that Sherman himself did this and tolerated this because he was such a racial egalitarian, and he was so hurt by the fact that there was racial inequality in the southern states, and that's what motivated him to burn the entire town of 2/3 of Columbia, for example. And this is probably the dumbest remark ever made by a neoconservative. That's really saying something. If you know anything about Sherman, I have some quotes from General Sherman I'm going to read to you later on that shows that he was as much a white supremacist as any man of his age or any other age. And so for someone like Victor Davis Hanson to say a statement like that is just patently absurd. But that's the type of thing you get when you read mainstream history books about this period of history. Sherman himself, early in the war, before he became famous for his famous march, in 1862, he was frustrated by his ability to subdue Confederate snipers and sharpshooters. And so he took vengeance upon the civilian population. He made speech after speech claiming that it was the faulty logic, those were the words he used, faulty logic of Southerners who thought secession was legal. And and that supposedly justified what he did. He took vengeance upon the whole population of Randolph, Tennessee by burning the whole place to the ground. Here's what he said. He wrote General Halleck. He said he decided to, quote, hold the neighborhood fully responsible. All the people are now guerrillas. So he considered all the people, men, women, children, to be enemy soldiers. And he ordered one of his subordinates, a Colonel Walcott, to burn the entire town down, but leave one house standing as an example, to mark the place where the town once was. And Mark Grimsley, the historian I mentioned earlier, he defends this sort of thing by saying this, quote, Sherman pursued a policy quite in keeping with that of other Union commanders from Missouri to Virginia. So they were all doing it. So he says in one part of his book, The Hard Hand of War, why is everybody so critical of Sherman when they were all doing this? They were all waging total war on civilians because that was the policy of the Lincoln administration. And so he damns him with faint praise, and he damns all the other generals as well. Here's how Sherman described his ultimate purpose in the war in a letter to his wife. And this is his own words. His purpose was, quote, extermination, not of soldiers alone. That is the least part of the trouble, but the people. The people, the extermination of the people in the South. His loving wife wrote back this. She said she offered her sincerest wish that the war would be a war of extermination and that all Southerners would be driven like swine into the sea. May we carry fire and sword into their states till not one habitation is left standing. What a sweetheart Mrs. Sherman was. I was on Cape Cod a couple of years ago, and driving around, there's one of the main highways that goes all the way across Cape Cod, Massachusetts. It's called the Grand Army of the Republic. And it sort of sickened me, it ruined my vacation already. The Republicans started calling themselves the Grand Old Party because they're such a grand bunch. And of course they call their army the Grand Army of the Republic. I think a more proper name would be the Grand Army of the Empire, not the Grand Army of the Republic. Here's what Sherman described when he described, in his own words, the destruction of Meridian, Mississippi. He said, for 5 days, 10,000 of our men worked hard and with a will in that work of destruction with axes, sledges, crowbars, claw bars, and with fire. And I have no hesitation in pronouncing the work well done. Meridian no longer exists. And so they totally destroyed Meridian, Mississippi also. Mark Grimsley writes that Grant, quote, Grant had approved the Meridian expedition and it formed a good example of the sort of war he expected to conduct against the South. And so it definitely was a war of terrorism and total war waged on the civilian population from the very beginning. And when Sherman got to Atlanta, the Confederate Army was gone. But they bombed the city of Atlanta for several days after the Army had left. And according to the official records, there were about 4,000 private homes in the city at that point. And keep in mind, there's no Confederate Army there, they're gone. And they bombed for 4 straight days so that there were only 400 left standing. So they destroyed 90% of all the buildings in Atlanta, including many churches. And if you read, there's a book called on waging war on Southern civilians. And it's based on the official records, the government's official records of the war. And it tells stories of how some of Sherman's artillerists were literally using private homes for target practice. They would wait until they saw a shadow or a figure and it looked like someone was there, and they would pinpoint that home and see and sort of compete with each other to see who could put a shell through the window of that house. And Sherman sat there approvingly the whole time. And his defenders, by the way, when I write about these things in my books and articles, I get emails from historians every once in a while defending Sherman by saying, by quoting his orders. They'll quote some order of his and say, we are not to disturb any houses, any private homes. And then he sits on his horse and watches his artillerists destroy private homes. And so the proof that he didn't do this is supposedly that he issued orders orders at some point to not do this, wink, wink. And Grimsley downplays the suffering of the citizens of Atlanta. After 90% of the buildings of Atlanta were destroyed, there were about 2,000 people left there, and they were kicked out of their homes and forced to just become homeless in November. And after two large armies had just eaten out the countryside by foraging. And Grimsley downplays this by, he said that there were only, his words, only a few thousand people. So, you know, what's your complaint? There was only a few thousand people that this was done to. And by October of 1864, Sherman gave up all pretense of legality when he ordered the shooting of randomly chosen civilians in retaliation for attacks by Confederate soldiers who would kill his soldiers. And if he couldn't apprehend the responsible parties, they would just randomly apprehend civilians and murder them. Here's one of Sherman's actual orders. These are his words. To a General Lewis Watkins, cannot you send over about Fairmount and Adairsville, burn 10 or 12 houses of known secessionists, kill a few at random, and let them know that it will be repeated every time a train is fired upon from Resaca to Kingston. And so that was part of the policy of the war also. A biographer of Sherman named Lee Kennett, he wrote also something similar to what Mark Grimsley wrote about some of the soldiers in Sherman's army. He said this: the New York regiments were filled with big city criminals and foreigners fresh from the jails of the old world. So in other words, some of the European governments emptied their jails because the Lincoln administration was hiring mercenaries by promising them land under the Homestead Act. And if you ever saw the movie Gangs of New York, there's a scene in there where these Irish immigrants are getting off the boat from Ireland, and they take about 10 steps and they sign up for the U.S. Army. And I'm not sure it was that immediate, but a lot of that did happen. A lot of that did happen, and of course, you know, many hundreds or thousands of them were killed in Virginia shortly thereafter that sort of happened. Clyde Wilson, the retired history professor from USC, one of his papers, he estimated that there were some 200,000 European mercenaries in the U.S. Army during this time. I don't know how accurate that is, but Clyde is a pretty renowned scholar, and so it carries a lot of weight as far as that goes. And of course, the slaves and free blacks were treated just as poorly as anyone else was. Grimsley says this, he says, with the utter disregard for blacks that was the norm among Union troops, the soldiers ransacked the slave cabins, taking whatever they liked. They often tortured or murdered slaves if they wouldn't tell them where the family valuables were hidden, and that sort of thing. And of course, in South Carolina, that was where Sherman was most eager to get to. One of his captains said this: the Army burned everything it came near in the state of South Carolina. A majority of the cities, towns, villages, and county houses have been burnt to the ground. This was one of Sherman's chaplains who wrote that. And of course, 2/3 of Columbia was burned to the ground. There was if anyone wants to read about this, of course there have been many accounts of this. But one kind of interesting account, there was a young woman named Emma LeConte, L-E-C-O-N-T-E, from Columbia, South Carolina. I ran across a book, Oxford University Press published a book of hers in 1957 about the burning of Columbia, which she witnessed as an 18-year-old woman. And so if you want to really read about that, I would recommend Emma LeConte's book accounting this. And here's just one passage from her book. She said, the fire on Main Street was now raging, and we anxiously watched its progress from the upper front windows. In a little while, however, the flames broke forth in every direction. The drunken devils roamed about, setting fire at every house the flames seemed likely to spare. They were fully equipped for the noble work they had in hand. Each soldier was furnished with combustibles they put up. They would enter houses and in the presence of helpless women and children poured turpentine on the beds and set them on fire. Guards were rarely of any assistance. Most generally they assisted in the pillaging and firing. And so that's the sort of thing that went on. Another famous general was Sheridan. And again, like Sherman, after the Confederate Army had vacated the Shenandoah Valley, he went on a looting, burning, and murdering binge of the civilian population and became quite famous for that. It is said that when, after the war was over, Sheridan was invited to speak to the Prussian army in Europe, and even the Prussians were appalled at the stories that had been told about the American way of waging war. And here's one example. There's a letter that Sheridan wrote to Grant in 1864 in the middle of his burning of the Shenandoah Valley. He said that we, quote, had destroyed over 2,200 barns filled with wheat, hay, and farming implements, over 70 mills filled with flour and wheat, have driven in front of the army over 4,000 head of stock, and have killed and issued to the troops not less than 3,000 sheep. Tomorrow I will continue the destruction. And a federal officer said this, describing the scene in the Shenandoah Valley. He said, the atmosphere from horizon to horizon has been black with smoke of 100 conflagrations. And at night it gleamed brighter and more lurid than sunset and shot from every verge. The completeness of the devastation is awful. Hundreds of nearly starving people are going north. Our trains are crowded with them. They line the wayside. Hundreds more are coming, so stripped of food that I cannot imagine how they escaped starvation. And one soldier wrote home, a federal soldier wrote home, that he had personally burned more than 60 private homes to the ground. And he said this in his letter. It was a hard-looking sight to see the women and children turned out of doors at this season of the year, end quote. And again, it was October, November, winter was coming, that this was happening. And so that's the famous General Sheridan in his work. And after Sheridan did that, of course, Lincoln famously extended to Sheridan his personal thanks and the thanks of the nation. Those are Lincoln's words for doing this. And of course, this is also around the time when Lincoln was making speeches about malice toward none, while congratulating his generals for doing this sort of malicious thing. And all of this is why a Sherman biographer named Lee Kennett wrote a very favorable biography of Sherman, as most all of them are. They all tend to be hagiographies and these sort of hero worship books. But he concluded, after writing about all these facts based on the official records kept by the government, he said this, he said, had the Confederates somehow won, had their victory put them in position to bring their chief opponents before some sort of tribunal, they would have found themselves justified, as victors generally do, in stringing up President Lincoln and the entire Union High Command for violation of the laws of war, specifically for waging war against non-combatants. And so, and keep in mind, this is a pro-Sherman biographer that wrote this. And of course, there are many, many excuses. If you get into this literature, you can read these facts, you can find these facts, but they're sometimes buried in excuses. And I'll give you one example of what I'm talking about. The historian Mark Neely, who I think he's the head of one of the numerous Lincoln museums in the country. I think there are maybe 10 or 20,000 of these things everywhere. And he's the head director of one of them. About Sherman, in one of his books, he said, Sherman and his fellow generals waged war in the same way most Victorian gentlemen did, and other Victorian gentlemen in the world knew it. So he was a Victorian gentleman in the way he waged war. And this statement by Neely is made in a book that has essays by 31 different authors. And the editor of that book, 31 different authors, said that Neely must have been commenting on a different war than the other 30 authors were commenting on to make a statement like this. So that's the sort of thing you get into when you get into this literature, that you can get these facts in highly regarded university press books, but sometimes the facts will be on one page and then there'll be 30 pages of excuses and flim-flam like this. And so sometimes you lose the facts because the context is so skewed. There was also another characteristic of the first major adventure of the U.S. military, the Civil War, was a massive desertion. There was desertion on both sides, to be sure. But there was a book on this, a very good scholarly book published by Ella Lon. The last name is Lonn, called Desertion During the Civil War. And it's based mostly on the official government records and letters from the generals to Lincoln and to Jefferson Davis and so forth. So it's pretty well documented on desertion. And on the Federal Army side, she says that although General McClellan had 180,000 men on his roster, his official roster, prior to the Battle of Antietam, otherwise known as the Battle of Sharpsburg, he had no more than 90,000 during the battle itself. So according to the official records, about half of the army just disappeared. And that was pretty typical on the eve of battle when that sort of thing happened. In June of 1862, General Buell reported from Tennessee that 14,000 officers and soldiers were absent. When General Hooker took command of the Army of the Potomac in 1863, in January, he wrote that, quote, desertions were occurring at the rate of several hundred a day, and about 25% of the Army was absent, according to his letters in the official records. And the response of the Lincoln administration was to execute deserters. And there's kind of an interesting story about this. There was a book published 10 or 12 years ago that was based mostly on a few letters that Lincoln supposedly wrote that overturned an order to shoot some deserters. And it was revealed just about a year ago that the letters were faked, that the person who found the letters in the archives actually changed the writing around the letters, and it sort of ruined his career. Because I've been reading, I've read Ella Lon's book, and I've been reading about desertions and the execution of deserters, and then I read this guy's book saying that Lincoln was a tender-hearted little pussycat. He was so gracious and full of grace that his mean generals wanted to execute deserters, but he stepped in and saved their lives. Not true. Not true. Here's what Ella Lon says based on the official records. Executions of deserters were taking place almost daily in the Army of the Potomac. General Halleck complained to Lincoln that hundreds of officers were almost continually absent from their commands, and that about 200 more were absent without leave every month. So there were 100,000 deserters from the Union Army in 1862. So what did they do? She writes that the Lincoln government, quote, had no compunction about shooting or hanging deserters who resisted arrest. And here's how it worked. Here's how she describes the scene in a typical Army encampment. And I'm quoting, a gallows and shooting ground were provided in each corps, and scarcely a Friday passed during the winter of 1863-1864 that some wretched deserter did not suffer the death penalty in the Army of the Potomac. The death penalty was so unsparingly used that executions were almost daily occurrences in most of the armies. So this happened. She goes on to write that the condemned men marched out between two ranks of the regiment, preceded by the musicians playing a funeral march. The provost guard, as an escort, carried the coffin. The victim was conducted to the edge of the grave, which had already been dug. After the sentence was read, he was seated, blindfolded, and placed upon a board at the foot of the open coffin, into which he fell backwards when the firing squad had discharged its sad duty. The method of execution was generally shooting, but hanging sometimes seems to be used occasionally. And so that was what really happened with regard to deserters, many of whom were conscripts, of course. They were draftees. That's why for many of these men, being drafted was worse than being a slave. At least the slave could always hope to escape, but there's no escaping death. If you weren't killed in the war and you tried to escape, you would be killed by the U.S. Army. And so those are some of the unsavory facts that I wanted to bring out about the first big military adventure by the military-industrial complex. And shortly after that, there was another big military adventure that happened that was commenced 3 months after the end of the so-called Civil War. I call it so-called because I prefer a war to prevent Southern independence. It's not going to catch on, except in a small group, but because of my belief that a civil war is a war over two sides fighting over control of the government. And Jefferson Davis did not want to run the government in Washington, D.C. any more than George Washington wanted to run the government in London during our first war of secession. And so I don't think it's accurate, even though it's been called that for a long, long time. But the next adventure by the U.S. military was the war, the 25-year-long war on the Plains Indians. That was commenced just 3 months after Appomattox. So on June 27, 1865. So the war ended officially in May of 1865. So just a couple months later, General Sherman is given command of the military district of the Missouri. The country was divided up into military districts by the U.S. government. And his job basically was to pave the way for the government-subsidized transcontinental railroads by killing as many of the Indians as he could. The famous book, there's a book, Hear That Lonesome Whistle Blow by D. Brown. D. Brown was the famous historian of the American West, author of Bury My Heart and Wounded Me, and it's a good history of the Transcontinental Railroad, Hear That Lonesome Whistle Blow. And here's one of the things he wrote about this enterprise that began during the war, and of course was continued after the war, the building of the Transcontinental Railroads, the government-subsidized Transcontinental Railroads. He says that Lincoln's Pacific Railway Act, which was passed in 1862, assured the fortunes of a dynasty of American families. The Brewsters, Bushnells, Alcotts, Harkers, Harrisons, Trowbridges, Landworths, Reeds, Ogdens, Bradfords, Noises, Brooks, Cornells, and dozens of others. All have wealth that lasts to this day. Their descendants all enjoy this great wealth that was created by their connections to the Republican Party during this era. For example, he writes that Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania received a block of Union Pacific stock in exchange for his vote for the Pacific Railroad bill. So back in the good old days, you could actually bribe members of Congress with stock out in the open. Here's some shares of stock, vote for my bill. And they try to do it, they do it still today, of course, but it's done more surreptitiously. He was a Pennsylvania iron manufacturer, and he also demanded a legal requirement that all the iron used in constructing the railroad be made in the United States, purchased from him, among other people. A congressman from Massachusetts named Oakes Ames was a shovel manufacturer, and he agreed to vote for the Pacific Railway bill if they used American-made shovels. And of course, it must have taken a lot of shovels to dig railroad beds from Iowa to California. And then so Sherman, right after the war, in his memoirs, here's what he writes. He says, as soon as the war's over, and he writes this, my thoughts and feelings at once reverted to the construction of the Great Pacific Railway. I put myself in communication with the parties engaged in the work, visiting them in person, and assured them that I would afford them all possible assistance and encouragement. And he also said, we are not going to let a few thieving, ragged Indians check and stop the progress of the railroads. And one of Lincoln's friends was a man named Grenville Dodge, who Lincoln made a general during the war. And his basic assignment during the war was to kill Indians, get them out of the way, and commence the building of the railroads. And so he did that. That's basically, he didn't really fight any real battles or was involved in any real battles with the Confederates, shooing the Indians out of the way. And he was made the chief engineer of the Transcontinental Railroad at the end of the war. And he recommended making slaves of the Indians. That was his recommendation to Congress. Congress and the administration decided not to make slaves of the Indians and to use federal soldiers as sort of a new brand of overseers. They decided to try to murder as many of the Indians as possible instead. And they succeeded pretty well. They ended up killing as many as 45 to 50,000 of the Plains Indians in the succeeding 25 years. And the rest of them they put in concentration camps called reservations. So that was the policy, although Dodge wanted to make slaves and have them make them slaves and have them dig the railroad beds. And so Grant made his old friend Sherman the Army's commanding general during all this time. And of course Sheridan joined in on this. And one biographer writes this. He says, the great triumvirate of the Union Civil War effort, Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan, this is Michael Fellman, the Sherman biographer, formulated and enacted military Indian policy until reaching by the 1880s what Sherman sometimes referred to as the final solution of the Indian problem. You can't make this stuff up, can you? The final solution, General Sherman, to the Indian problem. Michael Fellman goes on, he says, these men applied their shared ruthlessness born of their Civil War experiences against the people all three men despised. Sherman's overall policy was never accommodation and compromise, but vigorous war against the Indians, whom he regarded as a less than human and savage race. And so, and the other generals, there were many others too. Furman goes on to say they were like Sherman and Sheridan, Civil War luminaries. These included John Pope, O. Howard, Nelson Miles, Alfred Terry, Edward Canby, George Armstrong Custer, Benjamin Garrison, Winfield Scott Hancock, all the same crowd, all the same people, individuals. And Furman goes on to say Sherman viewed Indians as he viewed recalcitrant Southerners during the war and newly freed people after the war as namely resistors to the legitimate forces of an ordered society. And so Sherman was going to bring order to Indian society by killing as many Indians as possible. That would make society more orderly, apparently. And he goes on to say Sherman charged Sheridan, quote, to act with all the vigor he had shown in the Shenandoah Valley. So, and I just described the kind of vigor that Sheridan showed in the Shenandoah Valley. Another Sherman biographer writes that these Union Civil War veterans, they considered Indians to be subhuman and racially inferior to whites, and therefore deserving of extermination. And here's what he said. This is Lee Kennett, who was a Sherman biographer. And these are all mainstream Sherman biographers. You can pick up these books at any Barnes & Noble, or I'm sure the Furman Library has these books by Lee Kennett and John Barzilak and these other people I'm citing. He said this, quote, the Indians, this is Sherman's view, the Indians give a fair illustration of the fate of the Negroes if they are released from the control of the whites, Sherman once said. He said, the blending of, this is Sherman's words, the blending of races in Mexico had produced general equality, which led inevitably to Mexican anarchy. And so Sherman himself considered this what Michael Furman, his biographer, called a racial cleansing of the land. And so that's when I mentioned Victor Davis Hanson as saying, well, Sherman was so mean to Southerners because he was sort of a racial egalitarian and was offended by the racial inequality in the South. Well, I don't know if that's the dumbest thing or the funniest thing I've ever read by a historian. If you read Sherman's own views regarding the Indians and the blending of the black and white and Indian cultures in Mexico, he called these people who were of this ancestry mongrels, and called for a racial cleansing of the land and promised that this is not going to happen in America. We're going to at least take care of the Indians and make sure it doesn't happen that way, is what Sherman was saying. And of course, Sherman and Sheridan are famous for the old slogan that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And here's one of Sherman's actual orders was this: all the Indians will have to be killed or be maintained as a species of paupers. And that's pretty much what they did. He gave Sheridan prior authorization to slaughter as many women and children as well as men, because they decided, and Custer decided this too, that even though they were supposed to only engage in combat with the warriors, the Indian warriors, it was too burdensome to distinguish between men, women, children, horses, so they just killed everybody and everything, is what they did. They conducted more than 1,000 attacks on Indian villages over this 25-year period, 1865 to 1890, and they usually occurred in the wintertime when families would be together. And they also waged a war of extermination on the buffalo. And it wasn't just the tragedy of the commons that made the buffalo almost extinct. There was a concerted effort by the U.S. government to wipe out the buffalo herd, because the Indians used the buffalo for everything: food, clothing. They even used buffalo bones for fish hooks and things like that. And so if they didn't kill them outright, they tried to starve them out by waging war against the buffalo as well as the Indians. And so this war against the Indians actually took place during the Civil War and then continued for many years after it. And one awful example of it, of something that happened during the war, this is November 29th, 1864, there was a famous massacre called the Sand Creek Massacre. And there were a group of Indians in Colorado, southeastern Colorado, who had made peace with the U.S. government. The U.S. government told them, if you fly our flag over your teepees, we know that you're friendly, you just want to live in peace, trade with us, we'll leave you alone. So they did that. But here's what happened. There's an account of this in a book called Crimson Prairie, The Indian Wars. And it's written by S.L.A. Marshall. S.L.A. Marshall was the chief historian of the European theater of World War II. And he's the author of over 30 books on U.S. military history. So he's the government's official historian of the war in Europe during World War II. This is a man with some credibility. And he wrote about this in his book, Crimson Prairie. There was an officer named Shivington, Captain Shivington. Says his troops, quote, began, when they attacked this peaceful village, they began a full day given over to bloodlust, orgiastic mutilation, rapine, and destruction, with Shivington looking on and approving. D. Brown wrote about the Sand Creek Massacre also in Bury My Heart and Wounded Knee. In his famous book, Bury My Heart and Wounded Knee, he said this: when the troops came up to the squaws ran out and showed their persons to let the soldiers know they were squaws, and begged for mercy. But the soldiers shot them all. There seemed to be indiscriminate slaughter of men, women, and children. The squaws offered no resistance. Every one of them was scalped. And then he also writes about how after this, Shivington and his troops marched triumphantly through Denver with all these scalps and other body parts on display from the Indians. And it gets much grosser than just the scalping. And I'm not going to get into any more detail than that. And so that's what happened. Marshall called, this is a man who wrote 30 books on American military history, S.L.A. Marshall, and he calls Sheridan's orders to Custer, he calls them the most brutal orders ever published to American troops. And that's saying something for a man who wrote 30 books on the U.S. military history and wrote the entire official history of the European theater of World War II. And for example, what went on with Custer, his troops decided to do this, to kill or hang all the warriors, of course. That was the order. But that meant separating them from, I'm quoting from D. Brown, that meant separating them from old men, women, and children. This work was too slow and dangerous for the cavalrymen. They found it much more efficient and safe to kill indiscriminately. They killed 103 Cheyenne, but only 11 of them were warriors. The rest were women and children. And there are some books that try to take an accounting of how many of the Plains Indians were murdered in this way. And the biggest estimate is about 45,000, I think. And you can imagine that it must have been many times that much maimed and injured and given no medical care. Just as, with the Civil War, the official death count of the Civil War, by the way, for many, many years was 620,000 on both sides. But recently, just in the past year or two, there's some new research that says it might be more like 800,000 because of the government records being government records, not kept very well. And so, this was at a time when the population of the United States was about 30 million, about 1/10 of what it is today. So the death in the Civil War was the equivalent of 8 million Americans dying in 4 years. And so when you hear this number, 45,000, like Stalin is supposed to have said that a death of thousands, nobody cares, but a death of an individual that you can actually see, people make a much bigger deal out of. 45,000 might not sound like a lot, but considering the population of the American West at the time, that was a lot of death and a lot of slaughter, 45,000 people, even if it's over 25 years. And so to sort of wrap up the message of what I'm trying to convey here, I want to quote Ludwig von Mises on war. And he says this in The Human Action. He says, what distinguishes man from animals is the insight into the advantages that can be derived from cooperation under the division of labor. He's talking about the marketplace. Man curbs his innate instinct of aggression in order to cooperate with other human beings. That's the free market. The more he wants to improve his material well-being, the more he must expand the system of division of labor, specialization. Concomitantly, he must more and more restrict the sphere in which he resorts to military action. So military action and peaceful exchange are just the exact opposites. Human cooperation under the division of labor in a civil society bursts asunder, Mises wrote, whenever citizens turn into warriors. So what creates civilization is the international division of labor and cooperation in the marketplace. That's why we don't all live like cavemen and cavewomen. But war bursts all this asunder, excuse me, and destroys all this. And of course, Mises knows what he's talking about. He was in the Austrian army during World War I. Excuse me. And the U.S. government certainly dehumanized the Plains Indians just as they dehumanized Southerners. And I would argue that there's a lot of dehumanization of Southerners that still goes on to this day by the government and its various apparatchiks in the so-called private sector. For the same reason, basically, it bolsters the power and prestige of the state to do that, and the state's glorious victory in its wars. And the same dehumanization took place also in the late 19th century against the Filipinos, when the U.S. military went to the Philippines and slaughtered more than 200,000 Filipinos. President Theodore Roosevelt justified the slaughter of 200,000 or more Filipinos who objected to being made a part of the American empire since they had just gotten rid of the Spanish empire. Teddy Roosevelt, Bill Kristol's favorite president, he's a favorite of all the neocons, he justified the slaughter, in his mind anyway, by calling the Filipinos savages, half-breeds, a wild and ignorant people. Very similar to how Sherman described the Plains Indians, and how they also described, and how Sherman and his wife described Southerners during the war, in those letters that I read to you earlier. So that is always a part of the military policy, isn't it? When we engage in aggressive wars, the first step has to be the dehumanization of people. It sort of reminds me of how during the first Persian Gulf War, the rumor was spread that Saddam Hussein's soldiers were going into Kuwaiti hospitals and pulling the plugs on incubators and killing the preemies in a hospital. And of course, that was a ridiculous lie that was told, but that was just one tiny part of the necessary dehumanization of people who were picked out as enemies by the American military establishment. And there's a very long history of that. And so that's my story, and I'm sticking to it for now, and I guess we might as well. We do have a minute or two for Q&A if anyone would like to ask a question or denounce me for criticizing the military too harshly or anything else like that. We'll spend a few minutes if anybody has a question or two, and the students in particular. Somebody's pointing somewhere. Oh, yeah,
I'm kind of interested in this dehumanization question. I wonder if you could comment on whether this is going on now with regard to Iran or Islam in general. Are they? I mean, it seems like they're definitely doing it to us, but aren't we doing it to them to some degree?
Well, sure. There was a map. Excuse me, I've got an allergy attack today. There was a map on LouRockwell.com, a website, a couple of weeks ago, of American military bases. I think there's something like 38 of them surrounding Iran, and they're supposed to be the threat to us, even though we have 38 military totally circling the country of Iran in the Middle East. And their president is sort of a nutcase, but so are most of our presidents. And he says dumb and crazy things to appeal to the bourgeoisie. Our presidents say dumb and crazy things to appeal to the bourgeoisie also. Like, for example, there are weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein is going to fly over here in papier-mâché airplanes and drop them on New York City. You know, George Bush said that. You know, and so yeah, but I'm not afraid of Iran. Are you? I mean, why would they commit national suicide by picking a fight with the American colossus, the military colossus that we have? You know, Israel has hundreds of nuclear missiles. We have thousands. The idea that they would be just itching to develop a nuclear weapon to somehow smuggle into Chicago is just the craziest thing in the world to me. Another piece of war propaganda that's popular recently is that the Iranians want to shut off the Straits of Hormuz. Now, why would they destroy themselves economically? Why would they prohibit themselves from selling us their oil? That's what would happen if the Straits of Hormuz were shut off. Iran would not be able to ship its oil. Why would they do that? It's economic suicide. But what H.L. Mencken called the bourgeoisie, which is nobody in this room, of course, will buy that by the millions because they don't spend more than 10 seconds thinking about it. they see these politicians in Washington who usually, they never ever give a speech. If there's a television camera, there's always at least 30 flags behind them. And they make these pronouncements out there. And then their talking heads go on Fox News and elsewhere and repeat this over and over again. But yeah, that's what's happening with Iran. We always have to have a boogeyman. It was even when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, that was none of our business. The only argument that was made that it was our business was that it might cut off the oil supply. No, what would have happened was we would have been buying the same oil from a different dictator. Instead of buying it from a dictator of Saudi Arabia, the friend of the Bush family, we would have been buying the oil from a different dictator, the dictator of Iraq. And that's all. We wouldn't have suffered economically at all from that. But we did suffer from the war with death and money, as we always do in war. So you know, once he was gone, we need a new boogeyman to justify giving the military-industrial complex something to do. And so this guy in Iran is the next boogeyman, and the Syrians, and for example, Newt Gingrich published an article in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago entitled Lincoln and Bush, and he was urging President Bush to invade Iran, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Syria, and North Korea at the same time. and he was trying to say, you know, Father Abraham would approve if we did something like this. But Lincoln was a smart man, unlike Gingrich, and he would never approve something stupid like that. But that's the kind of war propaganda that the youth see. They're supposed to be threatened by the North Koreans who can't feed themselves. But yeah, that's a long-winded answer to your question about propaganda. Yes, sir.
You know, the whole thing with Lincoln and your point about, you know, the American Civil War, I think has created a paradigm of what government is supposed to do in war. And I was wondering how you think that paradigm applies, or should it, to something, for instance, in Libya, where government goes in to prevent genocide. Do you think there's ever a place for war to be waged to prevent something like genocide?
No, I don't think it's, if you want to volunteer yourself and go to Libya and try to prevent genocide, good luck to you. Please look at all the enemies we make when we stick our nose in everybody else's business. And so, and when have we ever prevented a genocide anyway? I mean, have we ever actually done that? It's always some sort of noble objective. But this actually is a very evil idea, and it comes from the whole Lincoln cult, because Lincoln redefined the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence was a declaration of secession from the British Empire. But by focusing only on those words, all men are created equal, Lincoln and people after him, academics, intellectuals after him, have reinterpreted that equality language to mean, well, if all men are created equal, meaning all men deserve political freedom everywhere, well, that means not just America, that means Libya, Pakistan, China, North Korea. Therefore, it is the duty of the U.S. government to make sure that all men are created equal. After all, that's the legacy of Abraham Lincoln and Father Abraham, as Jerry Jaffa calls in his books. And so, and that is a very insidious idea, because it means we need to get young American soldiers to go and die for causes that have nothing to do with defending their own freedom, their own families, and their own country. And so, and that's why I think it's a horribly insidious idea for that. And that, by the way, is why you see such a phenomenon as Ron Paul getting more support from active duty military people than all the other presidential candidates combined by a long shot, because his belief is his foreign policy is the Jefferson, Washington foreign policy. We have a military to defend us, not to go on global crusades to perfect humanity. And wasn't that what communism was about? The perfection of humanity? Wasn't that basically what they claimed to do? Why do we think we would be better at it than the communists were with our military? I think this man had a hand.
Yes. We talked about the heavy hand of the North, and Lincoln called for the extermination of the entire South. What changed between that and the Appomattox surrender? Everybody's pardoned, and all the generals are pardoned. of such?
Oh, yeah, there were people who wanted to execute all the Confederate generals. There are even people today who write articles like this. They should have executed not only the generals, but the civilian population. There's a guy that taught math at Vanderbilt who actually wrote an article saying that they should have just committed genocide in the southern states, started fresh. Because there are kind of crazy people that can write these things. But you know, what changed? Well, the war's over. The war's over, and so you know, why waste the ammunition? I guess must have been thinking of it. Some people, well, plus that would have been an act, a criminal act, to do these things. Part of the reason why it would have been in that, you know, Jefferson Davis was in prison for several years after the war. Anybody who's never brought the trial. And I'm convinced the reason for that is that they knew they would lose. Because the trial would have to be over the legality of secession. And he had some of the best lawyers in New York City volunteering their time to defend him. Because these lawyers were very, very angry at what happened to so many of their clients during the suspension of habeas corpus in the northern states, the shutting down of newspapers, and just the total destruction of civil liberties in the northern states for 4 years. And so they were eager to return civil liberties back to America, and they defended Jefferson Davis. But the trial would have had to have taken place in Richmond, and that's where the crime took place, you know, the alleged crime. So they didn't run on the trial because I think they knew they would have lost in court after winning. The idea that secession is illegal was won at gunpoint. It was not won in court or in a political battle. And they would have lost that in court, and they didn't want to take that risk. And so if they went ahead and murdered all the former generals, they would have been war criminals. And that, by the way, my theory of why Sherman and the rest were so brutal throughout the war, that you know, once you become a war criminal and murder civilians, you know, they were all taught at West Point that if your side loses, you can be hanged for that. So I think that's why they became more and more barbaric as the war got on, because they knew they had to win the war. They had to totally terrorize the southern population and destroy the whole civilization, you know, root and branch, or else they'll be hanging themselves. And so I think they understood that. That's just my speculation, though. I can't point to a statement that's answering your question that I've read. You know. Yes, we have time for one more question. I think this guy here had his hand up, the young man here.
One thing I've really been concerned about in Syria, I've read some reports that over 200 Christians have been kidnapped and murdered by the opposition forces that have been supported by Al-Qaeda, and that our officials are supporting to arm these forces, the opposition forces, against the Syrian government. One of my friends from Africa, he said, you know, millions of people die in countries like mine. You know, why does the United States not get involved with countries like mine, but they choose to get involved with countries that, you know, he said his perspective was where's the money's at, or where they have some other purpose. Do you think there's any other purpose that we might have trying to mislead people into getting into countries like...
You know, other than money? Other than money?
Yeah.
No. There are a few crazy people like Newt Gingrich who want to invade North Korea. I don't know if Newt will make any cash if we were to drop a nuclear bomb on North Korea. So you've got sort of the zany crowd like that. But yeah, there's you know, when you study economics, you know, the late George Stigler, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, who was famous for studies of government regulation. One of his sayings was, if you want to know who benefits from a government regulation, look at who lobbied for it. And that's always a good clue as to who would benefit from a regulation. And I think the same thing can apply to foreign policy, although it's hard. You need researchers like Bob Higgs back there to dig out the details of who's really benefiting from these sort of things. The average citizen has no ability to do that, but that's why you come to seminars like this, I guess, to try to find some of these things out. But yeah, if you're following the money is always good advice when you want to know why the foreign policy establishment is doing what it's doing. And it's not always just the money. You always have to have the ideologues. You know, Murray Rothbard once wrote that, you know, no government, no matter how totalitarian, can exist without an ideology that a large number of the people believe in that holds that government together, whether it's communism or Buddhism, or whatever the ideology is. And then once the people no longer believe in that ideology, then the government will fall, because after all, governments are always a relatively few number of people who control the governments. Look at the Soviet Union. They had hundreds of millions of people who could have overthrown them at any moment. But they had a relatively small group of people with lots of guns in charge of the government. But it was still the ideology that collapsed that caused the final collapse of the Soviet Union. And so you have to pay attention to that. That's part of it also. I guess our time, it's time for a break.